guys! I'm Maria. Welcome or welcome back. If you're new here, I basically talk about the US and its place in the world and why things are the way they are, which I really don't have the answer to, and I wish I did, but it's fun to talk about anyway. So this video is part 2 of my October series where I'm talking about like creepy, spooky, fear-related things until Halloween. Last week, I talked about the Kennedy curse and sort of the role of the Kennedys in American culture and politics in general. So if you haven't yet, I definitely recommend checking that out. I'm gonna try to put a card up here if I figure out how to do it. You'll soon find out. I'm not great at this like YouTube stuff, but we're figuring it out step by step. So since last week we talked about death and curses, this week I wanted to shift gears just a little bit and talk about fear. And when we're talking about contemporary US history, there are very few times when people were as afraid as they were in the 1950s. So I think that in the last decade or so, people, and especially younger generations, have sort of started to deconstruct a lot of the romance and nostalgia that surrounds the 1950s. But up until relatively recently, it was definitely a time that was looked upon very nostalgically by the average person. But it wasn't all milkshakes and poodle skirts. The 50s were a really weird time. As a response to the huge instability of the 30 years that preceded them, the 1950s were a time when a really strong emphasis and glorification was placed by general society on the American nuclear family. You know, that's the traditional middle class, heteronormative married couple with 2 to 3 kids, a house, white picket fence. You know, dad's the provider, mom's the child rearer and housekeeper, and we all live heteronormatively ever after. Over time, especially due to the really rocky 1960s and a culture that became increasingly socially liberal and sexually liberated and contrarian, the 50s became this sort of idyllic representation of real American values that politicians, both Republicans and Democrats, glorified and really continue to glorify in a lot of their speeches and a lot of their appeals to the American people. And some are more explicit than others, but I definitely think that this American lifestyle that was really quintessentially represented in the 50s is still evoked by most of our politicians today. It's funny because although the 1950s are remembered for their, economic stability and relative, at least surface level social stability, the 50s were actually a really rocky time. So segregation was in full force, particularly in the American South, where the civil rights movement was really taking root. Sit-ins, boycotts, and peaceful protests were breaking out all over the South, the most notable of which might have been Rosa Parks' refusal to move from her seat on a segregated bus, which took place in 1955. Another notable event was in 1957 when the Little Rock Nine became the first students to desegregate a formerly segregated school in Arkansas. So the United States was reaping the economic benefits of World War II, but it was also facing a lot of social repercussions because of that same war. Politically, post-war life was sort of characterized by increasing suspicion and fear of unfamiliar political ideologies. This growing suspicion and fear were exacerbated by a lot of things that happened in the late 40s and the early 50s, which includes the Soviet Union successfully testing a nuclear bomb in 1949, Mao Zedong's takeover of power in China in that same year. There was the Korean War, which broke out right in 1950 and definitely had the US kind of shaking in its boots about the communist country of North Korea, which still kind of is the case. So before we really dive into talking about the scares of the 1950s, I quickly want to go over some reasons why people were so primed to buy into these moral panics that were happening. Why were the 50s a time of such hysteria? Well, let's think about what happened leading up to the 50s and its ultra-conservative traditionalist ideology, right? You've got World War I in the 1910s. You've got the pretty unprecedented sexual and social liberation of the 1920s combined with Prohibition and the rise of the American gangster, all of this really chaotic energy in the 20s, followed by the huge stock market crash and Great Depression of the 30s, followed by the Second World War in the 40s. It's fucking wild. You know, people, for lack of a better word, were completely traumatized. Being a person in your 40s, 50s, or 60s, which, as we know, is the age of most American politicians to this day, being that age in the 50s meant having lived through all of that turmoil, which I think is pretty safe to say is one of the wildest roller coaster rides in modern American history. The instability of the early 20th century was threefold. It was social, economic, and political. I think that's the biggest reason why the 1950s placed such a huge emphasis on things like, you know, nuclear family and really heteronormative gender roles and sort of this socioeconomic conservatism and capitalism. These principles and ideas were both comfortable and comforting, you know, at least for middle and upper class white people, but
that's a conversation for another day.
For the majority of Americans, these traditionalist values represented the stability and comfort that the prior 40 to 50 years simply didn't hold for them. The decision-making generation of the 1950s was a troubled and scared one. They were really hesitant to accept the unfamiliar, if not outright terrified of it, which brings us right to communism. So let's talk about what was probably the most infamous scare of the 1950s, which of course was the Red Scare. So due to the relatively quick rise of communism all over the world, particularly in Eastern Europe and Asia, combined with the rise of sort of populist socialists in South America, communism was perceived as a big threat to American capitalism and, by extension, American democracy. You know, United States decision makers and politicians perceived communism as a direct threat to these values that, from their perspective, they and their country had spent all of these decades fighting on behalf of, right? A competitive free market, a democratic political system, and an overall emphasis on individualism and economic competition. On top of that, you have the fact that the American public was more attuned to political occurrences in the 50s than they had ever been before. With televisions making their way into the average American household, politics and political messages were really quickly and easily disseminated to the American people. Politics became more than this sort of civil service. It became a spectacle, which I talk about a lot in my Kennedy video, so check that out. On top of that, there was a huge fear and disdain for authoritarianism that was set up in World War II. So with these things combined, the American public was really well set up to be given messages that cultivated fear of authoritarian communism. And J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI at the time, and Joseph McCarthy, who was a politician and a wild dude, they really ran that fear home for the American people by running these highly publicized anti-communism campaigns that really exaggerated the threat of communism to the average American person. And the thing about hysteria is that it's self-perpetuating, you know? Think about it, like, have you ever, because I know I have, walked out of a scary movie and then had like something jump in the bushes or like a weird shadow or a weird noise come up and like freak the fuck out? Picture yourself having walked out of this traumatizing economic crash, a world war, maybe even two, all this social and economic turmoil, and then suddenly you're in this age of relative economic stability and peace. You're probably going to see threats to that everywhere you look because you're so used to being on your guard and experiencing all this shit, right? And this is especially true if you're not just one person who walked out of a scary situation, but part of a huge generation of people that just did too. You know, your fears are going to feel validated if they're also being experienced by everyone around you and exacerbated and sort of validated by the forces in your society that you consider authorities, like politicians and the news and things like that. So the Red Scare goes hand in hand with McCarthyism, which basically was a period from 1950 to 1954 when hundreds of American politicians, business people, and private citizens were accused of being either communists themselves or at least communist sympathizers, which led hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people to lose their jobs, to face trials, and to even be imprisoned for association with communism. And these were predominantly baseless accusations. They were often just speculation at best, but they really impacted so many people's lives and even more people's perceptions of their world and their neighbors. And though it was short-lived, McCarthyism definitely had huge implications for the overall American social consciousness. It really laid the foundation for the 30 years of anti-communist sentiment and fear that comprised the Cold War. So although it's by far the most talked about, the Red Scare was actually not the only major scare of the 1950s. It's not even the only one with a
fun nickname.
Let's quickly talk about the Lavender Scare, which was the 1950s moral panic over LGBT plus people. So, the Lavender Scare has many, if not all, of the same roots as the Red Scare. You have this fun hedonism of the 20s, followed by the devastation of the 30s, followed by World War II. These occurrences really made, the American mainstream really harken back and feel very protective and attached to traditional family values, which essentially means a nuclear family headed by a heterosexual cisgendered couple and their 2.5 children. In fact, communists and homosexuals were really often lumped together as like this one inseparable unit during a lot of the political propaganda of the time. The thing about the turmoil of the early 20th century and World War II in particular is that it drove LGBT plus people to no longer want to live hidden away in fear or in shame. Metropolitan areas like New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco had been developing significant LGBT plus communities over the course of the early 20th century. After the war, when so many people lost their lives, so many people's entire perceptions of the world and of life were completely shaken up, LGBT plus people were tired of hiding away and hiding huge parts of their lives. People who identified as non-straight or non-cisgender started to come out and live their lives publicly to the extent that they could and that it was safe. So you saw this primarily happening in metropolitan areas where this culture was already present. So this increased visibility of non-cis and non-straight people shook cis straight people in the United States in the 50s, especially the ones in government, because it posed this perceived threat to the traditional American nuclear family. And by extension, it created this perceived threat to the traditionalism and American values that this nuclear heteronormative family represented. In the 1950s, and sadly in many ways still today, this traditional family was equated to morality in the United States. In the 1950s, the heteronormative nuclear family represented everything that had evaded Americans for so long, namely stability and peace. The lovely Joseph McCarthy was also a prominent figure of the Lavender Scare, in addition to the Red Scare. I know.
Renaissance man.
His approach to the Red Scare, his McCarthyism, really helped to sort of inspire various initiatives over the 1950s to remove communists and homosexuals from government. Officials oversaw the outing, shaming, and firing of hundreds of people working in American politics over the course of the 50s. Thousands more people working in the political sphere or in public service were shamed and silenced with threats of being outed. In 1953, President Eisenhower even went so far as to sign an executive order that barred LGBT plus people from serving in any government positions. This was actually reinforced by President Truman, and it was eventually stricken down by the Supreme Court. Socially, LGBT plus people and communists weren't equated, but they definitely were mentioned together a lot. The point of this was to really rile up public resentment of and antipathy towards, if not outright violence against, these lifestyles that were considered subversive and threatening to American traditionalism. So that's the Lavender Scare. Though to the extent that I know, they're the only ones that have fun little nicknames. The Red Scare and the Lavender Scare were only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to overall 1950s moral panics. The ideal American family wasn't just heteronormative and capitalist. It was white. Segregationalist beliefs were widely upheld by the American mainstream, particularly in the South, but there was definitely a white supremacist undertone to general messaging in the 1950s, regardless of geography in the US. The civil rights movement started to make small but significant strides in the 50s, but it wouldn't really fully come to fruition until the mid to late 1960s. By the way, Mexicans, which was just sort of a blanket term for Latinx people, especially brown and black Latinx people, were also expected to adhere to segregationism. So there's that. Japanese internment camps had just happened in the early to mid 40s, and there was widespread discrimination against Asian American people throughout the 1950s. So basically, fear was at the root of a lot of anger and a lot of persecution, as it often is, as sort of a reaction to the instability of the early 20th century. A lot of American politicians and government officials weaponized that fear against marginalized groups. And of course, I'm not going to minimize it. Communism was a real thing, and it was damaging and hurting millions of lives across the globe. Authoritarian communist governments were destroying and ending thousands and thousands, if not millions of lives at that point. So it absolutely is important to note that communism was making a lot of damaging moves on the world, but the impact of communism within the American borders, the promotion of this culture of suspicion and fear within the US borders against communism, the ideas that your neighbors could be communists who were spying on you, or that teachers were indoctrinating students with communist ideas, or we all had to be vigilant against the communists in our neighborhoods. That was definitely something that was really exacerbated by Joseph McCarthy and his entire philosophy. Though the 1950s were idealized and can still often be looked back on as a time of relative social stability and economic success and this charming traditionalism, it was a much more complicated decade than that. It was a time when fear essentially called the shots. It set the stage for the turmoil and instability of the 1960s. American culture in the 50s, I think, could feel itself changing. And I think, as is sort of characteristic of human nature, it really resisted that change in aggressive and damaging ways. And I'm not just here saying, the 50s were trash for everything and everyone all the time. There is a reason why there's so much nostalgia surrounding the 50s. It was a time of relative economic peace and growth, and it was sort of a much needed respite from world wars and the highs and lows of the early 20th century. But it was by no means a perfect time. I think this decade serves as a really effective example and reminder of the power that fear can have in really completely mangling your perspective. And I think it's important to remember that change is inevitable, and that responding to impending change with nothing but blind fear does way more harm than good. Like I said, change was then and still is and always will be inevitable. I think that that's a really comforting thing to remember, especially with everything that's going on right now. But yeah, that's the video. I really hope you guys enjoyed hearing a little bit about the 50s and how much fear surrounded that decade. I know this is kind of a different style from the Kennedy curse and the outright creepiness of that, but I figured fear was a pretty relevant thing to talk about with Halloween around the corner. Be sure to be on the lookout next Tuesday, because I'm gonna come at you with another video that's sort of in this spooky, creepy fear realm, and I'm really excited about the topic. So looking forward to sharing it with you guys. If you want, take a sec to like and subscribe and turn on notifications. That really helps this channel out. Yeah, so thank you so much. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. As always, please tell me what you thought of this video, what you think about the 50s as a decade in general. I love hearing what people have to say. So yeah, thank you so much, and I will see you next week. Have a great day. Bye.